Today's gospel lesson demonstrates a little literary technique that we see in the Gospel of Mark from time to time. If you notice the way this story goes as we read it, there actually are two stories here, two different events, and one is self-contained but is in the middle of two parts of the other story. It's sort of like a story sandwich. And that's a device that Mark will often use to show something of great importance and also to relate how these two events are somehow connected. They're not connected necessarily in time, nor are they necessarily connected in any other way, except for the message that Mark is trying to give to the reader. And so we have to plumb that out just a little bit. We have two stories, the story of Jairus, the synagogue leader, and his daughter, and the story of the woman who was suffering for 12 long years from this chronic condition of hers. And there are some facts that we need to fill in so that we get a more fulsome understanding of what Mark is trying to get across. And we need to fill them in part because many of Mark's hearers would have understood certain things about these stories that is really not part of our experience nor our way of thinking. Perhaps let's start with the woman who has the 12 years long affliction of constant hemorrhaging. That means bleeding. That's bad enough in and of itself. But what we often forget is the fact that actually things like this, under the law of Moses, made people unclean. And because they were unclean, they could not worship in the temple, nor could they go even to the synagogue, the local sort of chapel, to gather with their neighbors and friends and family to worship. In fact, the process of worship was set up in such a way as to make sure this did not make other people unclean. That's why, for example, women were separated away from the men in the synagogues. In fact, they had to worship behind a grate. There was like a screen, a grate that separated the men from the women. And the reason behind that was because of the natural course of events in physiology. A woman who has experiencing their monthly cycle may in fact start that and touch someone, the men, who would then become unclean. And suddenly they had to not lead worship or be part of the worship service. It was that severe. So if those kinds of precautions were taken for the usual kinds of things that happen on a regular basis, imagine for a moment what this woman was experiencing. Because this was a chronic condition for her. It didn't just happen periodically. It was happening all the time. And it happened for her over the course of 12 long years. So quite apart from the physical pain and suffering that she might have felt, more than that, she would have been isolated from everyone else around her. She would have been essentially pushed to the edge of society like a leper. She was a constant source of ritual impurity and therefore was not to be dealt with. So not only in worship, but because any kind of uncleanness in this way required by the law of Moses that anyone who became unclean had to go through a certain set of rituals to be purified, to become righteous again in the sight of God. And so if you happen to just casually come in contact with her. You would have to go through this long purification ritual, which included a bath and included showing yourself to the priests and all of this kind of stuff. So this was critical to the story. We probably just feel sorry for her, very badly for her suffering, but it was much larger than simply the physical ailment that is described there. She became a social pariah. So she didn't talk to she was just left to the side. So now imagine that all the people in that village there were coming to see Jesus as he was teaching. It said the great crowd gathered around him. And there she is, after all that she had done. She had spent all of her money on doctors and physicians and was unable to find a solution to her problem. So she is just utterly frustrated and demoralized and at her wits' end. But she hears about this healer, this one who exercises such great power. So she determines for herself, I am going to see him. And it's not even to talk to him. She was humble enough to feel that he must have such great power. If I simply just touch the edge of his cloak, that will be enough. Such was her faith. So imagine the scene. This big crowd around Jesus. And she, who is supposed to be an untouchable, is pushing people to the side, touching everybody in her course. Everybody would have known who she was. These villages were not big. Everybody would have known what was going on, and they would be just angered. She was taking her life into her hands. She was putting her well-being at risk just to touch the fringe on Jesus' cloak. That's the story. And in Mark's typical way, he uses a word which is a sort of flag that you know something really great is happening, because he uses the word immediately. It's more than just a description of what happened. It is a sign in Mark's gospel that something great, a work of God, is about to happen. And so he describes it immediately. As she touched the hem of his garment, she felt herself come together. That what had been afflicting her these many, many years, the pain and the suffering in her body, was ebbing away. Immediately. But likewise, in the very next sentence, we hear that immediately Jesus felt the power go out of him. You know, this business of healing, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy. Talk to a healthcare professional. It can be very draining, not only in the physical work involved, but very often in the emotional work that is involved as well. And so all of this healing that Jesus is doing, we kind of see him as the Son of God. So, oh, yeah, no problem. He just touch, healed, gone. No, this was taking a toll on Jesus as well. And the word that is used there, the power came out of him. The word often that we hear again is exousia. It comes from the very authority of Jesus. It comes from his very essence, from his very being. Almost as if the feeling of goodness and wholeness that this woman is feeling now is coming out of Jesus' body and into hers. Almost like one of those sci-fi things where they put a cap on your head and cap on another and there's some sort of transfer of something. That's the dynamic that's occurring here. Jesus feels the power go out of him, and so he wheels around and he says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples go, "Oh, you're crazy. Look at all these people. They're all over you. How can you even ask that question?" But Jesus knew. He knew the feeling. And this woman suddenly got caught. Suddenly got caught. And she said, oh, I better fess up. So she goes up to Jesus and says, Lord, it was me. Don't blame anybody else. It was me. And he does a marvelous thing here. He brings the healing full circle, completes it. We just described how she would have been a person pushed to the side, neglected. Just imagine. Jesus turns to her, doesn't scold her for doing this. He turns to her and with great love calls her daughter. Daughter. There is suddenly a level of intimacy between Jesus and this woman. An intimacy that we know only in a family. An intimacy where Jesus' care for her is as a parent for a child. Daughter. She is restored not only in her body, not only to her family, not only to her community, but to God himself. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Now go. Don't trouble yourself anymore. In the meantime, a parent, deeply concerned for his daughter, is watching all of this, at least in the context of the story. And someone from his household comes to him and says, it's too late. Your daughter has died. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. And Mark says very pointedly, Jesus overhears this conversation. And he turns to Jairus, the leader. Now this leader, you must understand too, the synagogue leader wasn't simply a preacher or someone who coordinated a religious community. In these little towns, the synagogue leader was not only the chief religion person, the synagogue leader was often like the mayor of the town. This was a very important person. And so Jesus turns to him and says, don't worry, have faith. And they continue on. And because of the intimate nature of what is about to occur, Jesus takes with him only his closest associates. Just a few. And the girl's mom and dad, and they go up to the room where the girl is laying there. And Jesus does something else. He takes her by the hand, and he uses beautiful words in Aramaic. Talitha kum. Little girl, get up. Notice Jesus takes her hand. That's yet another way you become unclean. It's yet another way that you separate yourself off from the community. It's yet another way that the law of Moses requires you to go through all of these rituals of purity and cleansing. If you touch and deal with a dead body, that's what you have to do. If you touch bodily fluids or a dead person, you are unclean, and you must be purified before you can be restored to the community. And Jesus says, none of that matters. None of that matters for the woman who touched the hem of his garment. None of that matters for this little girl. None of that matters for this father and this mother who are broken-hearted at the death of their daughter. No. The most important thing Jesus is teaching us, and that's the point that Mark is trying to make, is it doesn't matter, old or young, whether it is some sort of affliction that you can deal with or one that is not, like death. Well, none of it really matters. All that matters is compassion. All that matters is rising above yourself and moving out and having empathy for others, looking at their lives and feeling what they're feeling, and then move to do what you can do to make their life whole again. Jesus knew power went out of him, and the woman was healed. Jesus reaches down and takes a dead girl's hand and says, "Little girl, get up." Both daughters of the King, both daughters of the Most High God. And Jesus restores them both to wholeness and to life. I'm still trying to figure out why. I really don't know. But Mark includes this little bit of detail. The woman suffered for 12 long years, and the little girl was 12 years old. I think the coupling that Mark makes, that these two stories relate to each other. I don't know how else to think of it. But if you want to get something from today's lesson, what we get from this is that central teaching of Jesus that regardless of what religious sensibilities you have, regardless of what the laws and strictures of your religious practice are, the most important thing is compassion. To move out of yourself, to feel another's pain, and to do what you can do to heal and bring wholeness. That's what we are called to do. You and I. Perhaps we cannot raise the dead. Perhaps we cannot impose hands on someone and have a long and chronic illness healed. But we can feel their pain. We can walk with them. We can sit with them. We can talk with them. We can hold them in tenderness and speak kindly words to them, words that raise their dignity and say that they are never alone in their illness. This we can do. And this is what Jesus bids us to do today. To move out of ourselves and to stop being so concerned about everything that makes us healthy, and to look at those who suffer around us in the world, whether we know them or not, whether they are old or young. Reach out to them, take them by the hand, and with great compassion, speak those kindly words from your heart. Be healed. Be whole. Be at peace. For I am here, and I am with you. Not because I am special, but because each of us bears the mark of Christ. And when we move out and take one's hand and speak these kindly words and raise their dignity, even in their illness or their affliction, it is Christ who is doing it. For Christ lives in us, and we in him. So today, we hear these oddly put together stories. But interestingly, they do make sense together. And they are a time and a challenge for us to move out of our own concerns and to look at a hurting world and be for that world the very presence of Christ. For as we do so, we begin to follow in the way that Jesus commands. Love one another as I have loved you. Do this, and you will be close